If teaching were like a sport where educators were paid millions a year, how would you physically and mentally prepare yourself to perform at the highest levels over an extended period of time? Today's article, which is titled The Making of a Corporate Athlete, which is by Jim Loehr and Tony Schwartz, explores this idea in corporate culture. But we're going to talk about what this might potentially look like for computer science educators. Talked a lot about how educators can prevent burnout, and in many of the interviews I asked the guests how they iterate on their own abilities as an educator, as a researcher, or whatever. One of the reasons why I asked that question is because I took a sports psychology class during my undergrad, and it has heavily shaped how I look at teaching. One approach to teaching is helping students be able to develop expertise over an extended period of time. Because in all my roles, I saw students over many years, I didn't think about just like, what am I going to do for this particular quarter, semester, or year to help a student understand the subject area, but what am I going to do over multiple years or even a decade to help them improve as a musician, as a computer science student, whatever. And many of the guests have talked about the importance of social and emotional learning, but some of them have even pointed out that, this doesn't just apply to students, this also applies to educators. We need to take care of ourselves. And if we want students to be able to perform at the highest level over an extended period of time throughout their K-12 and potentially collegiate tenure, what about educators? So the authors begin this article talking about how most of the coaching that they see for C-suite executives and people who are just like high performers in corporate culture focus almost entirely on like cognitive capacity and don't necessarily look at the person holistically. The authors describe something known as the high performance pyramid, which they think is a more holistic approach that you could take to performing at high levels. We're going to talk about this in relation to education. But at the bottom of the pyramid is physical capacity, which, quote, builds endurance and promotes mental and emotional recovery, end quote. Above that is emotional capacity, which, quote, creates the internal climate that drives the ideal performance state, end quote. And above that is mental capacity, which, quote, focuses physical and emotional energy on the task at hand, end quote. And then finally is spiritual capacity, quote, which provides a powerful source of motivation, determination, and endurance, end quote. And spiritual capacity might be different than what you're thinking, so stay tuned to learn more about each one of these 4 different areas of the high performance pyramid. Here's a really interesting quote in the section that is titled Ideal Performance State. Quote, in training athletes, we have never focused on their primary skills, how to hit a serve, swing a golf club, or shoot a basketball. Likewise, in business, we don't address primary competencies such as public speaking, negotiating, or analyzing a balance sheet. Our efforts aim instead to help executives build their capacity for what might be called supportive or secondary competencies, among them endurance, strength, flexibility, self-control, and focus. Increasing capacity at all levels allows athletes and executives alike to bring their talents and skills to full ignition and to sustain high performance over time, a condition we call the ideal performance state, end quote. Now, this is really interesting if we kind of look at what this might look like for educators. I would argue that this is very different for most educators. A lot of PD and administrators tend to treat educators as if they don't know something. So they go for like the lowest possible an entry-level educator just stepped out of college, or maybe even a student teacher. And if you just look on like social media, like TikTok or whatever, you're gonna find a bunch of educators who have recently been posting what their PD experiences are like, where they kind of talk down to as if like adults can't figure out how to socialize or work on their own. The main point of this is that instead of focusing on like the very basics of here's a transition statement that you can do to get from one lesson to another, we could instead focus on here's how to prevent burnout. Here's how to set appropriate boundaries between work and home life. So instead of focusing on like rote basics of pedagogy that you could learn in a 100 level course, administrators, PD providers, etc. for districts might actually focus on other areas like what do you do to prevent burnout? How do you try and set appropriate boundaries between work and home life? How do you oscillate between high performance in the classroom and recovery outside of the classroom? What strategies do you use to kind of do a mental reset in between classes or lessons? All of these are topics that could be discussed in district level PD, PLCs, etc. But instead, at least from my experiences and what I've seen from other educators, it focuses on other very basic things that, again, you could learn in a 100 level course or by reading like a magazine article about education, because the topics tend to like skim the surface on what you could actually discuss in education, which is one of the reasons why I started this podcast, is to actually dive deeper into literature and talk about what does this mean for educators, rather than just focusing on the same basic stuff that is often shared in like blog posts and whatnot. Nothing against that. There's definitely a space for it. But how do you, as an educator, actually iterate on your abilities over time? Rather than learning a new activity or a new lesson that you can do, what do you do to refine your own teaching practices? One approach that they talk about very early with a lot of athletes and a lot of high performance C-suite executives, etc., is an oscillation between stress and recovery. Quote, in the living laboratory of sports, we learned that the real enemy of high performance is not stress, which, paradoxical as it may seem, is actually the stimulus for growth. Rather, the problem is the absence of disciplined, intermittent recovery. Chronic stress without recovery depletes energy reserves, leads to burnout and breakdown, and ultimately undermines performance. Let's talk about the first part of the pyramid, which is physical capacity, and how that might be beneficial for educators to focus on if they want to perform at higher levels over an extended period of time without burning out. Quote, energy can be defined most simply as the capacity to do work. Our training process begins at the physical level because the body is our fundamental source of energy, the foundation of the performance pyramid, end quote. So the authors talk about how if you're trying to build muscle, that you need to give time in between your workout to allow the muscle to rest. If you do not stress the muscle, so you do not work out, then it can lead to weakness, atrophy, etc. Just think about like if you're ever put into a cast or something, unable to kind of like move your arm, it's going to like significantly change your muscle size if you're unable to do that for an extended period of time, like months or years. However, if you were to only work out 24/7, you could also lead to injury, strain, all sorts of problems with the muscles as well. So it's important to not only to stress or strain something, but to also recover from that. So if we talk about this in relation to education, it's extremely important to take some time to step away from teaching. Don't take papers home to grade. Don't respond to emails on weeknights and weekends. Actually take your sick days, especially when you're not feeling well, and actually take your paid time off. And on fall, winter, spring, and summer breaks, actually take breaks. But what about in the micro stage in terms of being able to recover from one lesson to another? I don't know about for you, but I had some classes that were like consistently great to work with, and some classes or some individuals who were consistently challenging at times. I realized early on that I needed to be able to just kind of like come up with some sort of a mental reset in between those classes. Because if I had a very difficult student in one class, I didn't want it to kind of like carry over into the next class and have a bad attitude or something, which would cause students to have like a bad experience in that class. One of the things that I started doing was like mini little workouts in between my sessions to kind of like process the energy. So I do like just like push-ups, or I do like really slow like diamond push-ups or something, just to kind of get that energy out and to kind of relax. Another thing that I do is just like a very short meditation. I just sit and focus on my breath, or focus on my circulation and my blood, like feeling the timing difference between my heartbeat and my wrist. That for me is very calming. There are many little rituals that you can do in between each one of the classes, and the authors talk about how this is very important for athletes and for corporate athletes. But we can apply this to educators. One of the things they talk about is like if you miss a shot or miss a goal as an athlete, it can be devastating, but then you're expected to perform like immediately. You got to get right back into it, depending on what kind of sport you're doing. So if you like botch a serve when you're playing tennis or something, you can't be stuck in that mindset and be like, oh, I messed up. Instead, you have to press F5 and just kind of like mentally refresh and then try another serve. Same thing for teaching. In between each one of your classes, or even if you're working with a difficult student and then you walk over to the next student right next to them and they're a great student, you want to make sure you're not in that mental space where you're still like, oh, I'm frustrated, but are instead more calm and are able to like assist the student. So the authors mention that the players who are able to have these little mental refreshes in between moments of high performance, this quote, allow players to avoid negative feelings, focus their minds, and prepare for the next point. By contrast, players who lack between point rituals or who practice them inconsistently become linear. They expend too much energy without recovery. Regardless of their talent or level of fitness, they become more vulnerable to frustration, anxiety, and loss of concentration, and far more likely to choke under pressure, end quote. Now imagine if we focus on this more in our PLCs. This, I think, would be very beneficial for educators. What kind of strategies do you use to press F5 in between difficult moments when teaching? Let me know in the comments. I'm genuinely curious. Imagine if you watch into the teacher's lounge or like the copy room or whatever, and educators were talking about their workouts, how they're recovering from their workouts, what they do to mentally refresh in between lessons, how they're trying to practice good sleeping and eating rituals, etc. What if that was kind of a focus that educators had in those social spaces? Wouldn't that also have a positive impact on student performance? If the educators are performing better because they're taking care of themselves, how might that help? That's one of the things the authors talk about in a little bit further down in the same section. And I agree with this. I really genuinely think that there's a lot of things that could be discussed around education that aren't necessarily typically discussed. Again, how do you take care of yourself? Like here's a quote from one of their participants. Quote, I really do believe that when you learn to take care of yourself, you free up energy and enthusiasm to care more for others, end quote. I totally agree. So let's talk about how we might do that with the next part of the high performance pyramid, which is the emotional capacity. And the authors describe emotional capacity as, quote, the internal climate that supports peak performance, end quote. So again, if it's important for students to focus on SEL, some of the interviews that I've done on this podcast have raised the question of, well, shouldn't educators also do that? Here's a quote that kind of relates to that. Quote, just as positive emotions ignite the energy that drives high performance, negative emotions, frustration, impatience, anger, fear, resentment, and sadness, drain energy. Over time, these feelings can be literally toxic, elevating heart rate and blood pressure, increasing muscle tension, constricting vision, and ultimately crippling performance, end quote. Now, one way you can focus on this is, again, to focus on SEL. Another thing is this 5-step ritual that the authors describe. So the first step is to become more aware of what your body is signaling to you. So what's the physical tension? How's your heart rate? Do you have a tightness in your chest, etc.? If so, the authors recommend taking some time to close your eyes and take several deep breaths so you can focus on inhale and exhale. One of the things that Andrew Huberman talks about is parasympathetic breathing, where you take 2 inhales in your nose and a long extended exhale where you completely get rid of everything in your lungs. When you take those inhales, you try and take as big of breaths as possible to expand your lungs, and then that second inhale expands it a little bit more, so it expands the little sacs that are on your lungs, and it will calm you down. So that's one approach that you can do for this. The authors then recommend next focusing on not just your breath, but how you can relax your face, the tension in your face, the muscles, etc. The next thing that they recommend is to focus on softening your voice and speaking slowly. And then the last step that they recommended in a moment where you're like having a negative emotion, like let's say with a student or administrator or a teacher or whatever, is to imagine yourself in that person's shoes. What are they feeling right now? What are they thinking? And then reframing some kind of response in a positive way. So these are some potential steps that you could do to kind of respond in negative situations. But what approaches do you use? Let me know in the comments. I'm always happy to learn some new approaches, and I think it's important for educators to share them. Note that if you try and do something like this, it can feel forced or robotic. So over time, things can become better with more practice. One of the things that the authors mentioned is that many athletes will try and develop some kind of ritual to get themselves into a state of high performance. Like if, as an example, many will put on like headphones and whatnot before they're going to perform, and they have like the same playlist that kind of gets them into a mindset ready to go. And they might even like visualize what they're going to do. What is this performance going to look like? And go through like every single motion when they are about to perform. What might that look like for educators? How can you get yourself into a mindset to teach? Like as an example, when I used to teach drumline, when I would drive to rehearsals, I'd listen to recordings of drumlines that were professional level when I was working with a high school group. That got me excited on my drive out to go work with that drumline. Or you might have a specific playlist that just kind of gets you pumped up, excited, energetic, ready to teach. Or maybe it calms you down. Maybe you have a playlist in between your classes, like during your lunch break, like a meditation playlist. You take some time to recover there. Just kind of relax instead of just go, go, go all the time. And I say that as somebody who is recording a podcast when it is over 90 degrees in my house. My AC's broken, so if you see me sweating, that's why. Some of the other things that the authors talk about in this particular section is how body language can influence emotions, but I've heard since then that there's some research that kind of debunks that. But another thing they do mention that I have heard a lot of positive things about is just having close relationships. This can be relationships within the domain of education. This can be relationships outside of that. It's beneficial, honestly, to have some friend groups that are outside of what you do for a living. It can help with just like taking your mind off of it, so you're not just constantly sitting around talking about work. And if your friends are all educators, perhaps talk about something else. It just helps with recovery. So the next part of the pyramid is mental capacity. The authors mention that this is where most of like the coaching and training kind of takes place. They focus on the cognitive side of things. Sun Tzu has a quote that roughly translates to something like, a general's most important asset is their ability to focus, or their attention. The ability to focus is extremely important. Think about how that relates to students learning. If students are hungry, or have a sibling who is in the hospital, or were unable to sleep last night because their parents were arguing the entire night, or any number of factors that might impact students' ability to focus. Think about how that impacts their ability to learn, or to create. Now look at other educators. Think about some of your colleagues, or even yourself. What happens when your car breaks down and you're like an hour late to work? Or maybe you got into an argument with your significant other and it was unresolved because you went to work. All of those things that you might be thinking about in the background are going to have an impact on how you teach. Your attention is going to be elsewhere and is not going to be on teaching to the best of your abilities. So if as educators we can talk about how you develop that focus. Again, maybe it's a ritual like listening to a specific playlist before you start teaching to get yourself into a mindset. Or maybe it's just the parasympathetic breathing that I mentioned in between each one of the lessons or in between students. Just kind of mentally reset. Okay, now I'm ready to go again. But what approaches do you use to focus? Let me know in the comments. One of the ones that I personally use is meditation, or attention training, as I like to call it, where I will often just focus on an object to just like look at it, or just listen, or just feel the sensations in my body, like what does my circulation feel like, etc. There are so many different ways to meditate. It's not just about clearing your mind, but some of them are about like just focusing on your breathing. What does it feel like going in and out of your nose? What temperature is it? Is it cooler when it goes in, or is it cooler when it goes out, etc. And again, the authors mention that it's extremely important to focus on alternating between stress and renewal. This is emphasized throughout this article, and I'm going to emphasize it throughout this podcast. Here's a quote. Quote, "Have you ever suddenly found the solution to a vexing problem while doing something mindless, such as jogging, working in the garden, or singing in the shower? That's the left brain, right brain switch at work, the fruit of mental oscillation," end quote. So if you plan in oscillations between work and non-work, or stress and recovery, it's like you're almost taking one step back for the recovery period to be able to take 2 steps forward. That is something that we need to be able to figure out how to do when the day is planned for you. Class periods were not up to me. When the school started and when it ended was not up to me. When my lunch break was not up to me. But what was up to me was what I did in those 5 minutes in between each class, or what I did on my lunch break when I would go and have a walking meditation along a bike path. And if you don't have those options, like if your lunch break is full and you don't have passing periods between your classes, which one of my schools didn't, literally back to back to back, one of the things that I would do is just kind of like take a step back. While students were working, just take a minute. Just observe. That's a form of recovery where you're just kind of mentally giving yourself some time to breathe and then continue to walk around the room and facilitate. But what works for you? How do you oscillate between stress and recovery when you're teaching throughout the day? Let me know. Another strategy that the authors talk about is the use of visualization. So many athletes will visualize before they are going to perform something, like a serve or whatever. They will visualize what that serve is going to look like with a high verisimilitude. So make it as lifelike as possible. How might we actually use that in education? For example, if you're going into a meeting with an admin, or maybe you are an admin and you're meeting with an educator. What would it look like if you took a few minutes beforehand to just kind of visualize how you want to present yourself in that meeting and how you want to speak to the other individuals in that meeting? How are you going to bring up a topic, etc.? I've heard many people who are like in meetings throughout most of the day, like C-suite executives and whatnot, talk about just how much of a difference 5 to 20 minutes of preparation can go for a particular meeting. If you just take the time to kind of visualize what you want it to look like, mentally prepare for it and plan for it, what might you do? Same thing can apply for lessons. Visualize, what will this intro look like? How will I spark curiosity and joy and wonderment? You just take a couple minutes to do that. Visualize what that would look like. How might that impact your teaching? Or how might that impact the parent conferences that you might have, or the communication that you might have with parents that are difficult? Having taught at the university level and failed some students from a class that prevented them from graduating for an entire year, those conversations are difficult. So spending some time to kind of prepare for it in advance and think through how are you going to manage emotions and whatnot, and respond when somebody else does not manage their emotions well. It can make all the world of a difference, whether it's parent conferences, performance reviews, a lesson, whatever. So how do you prepare for those moments? Let me know. Now, the last area is called spiritual capacity. And the authors clarify that they refer to spiritual capacity as, quote, the energy that is unleashed by tapping into one's deepest values and defining a strong sense of purpose, end quote. So that's very different than what I initially thought it was going to be when I first read the heading for this. So many of the guests who have been interviewed on this podcast talk about how they find great fulfillment and joy working with other students, and how this is kind of their sense of purpose or their why for what they do. That's great, but there are some other approaches that you can also use, like just taking breaks. Again, oscillating from stress to recovery. Having rituals that kind of help center yourself, like working out before you start teaching, or even at the end of the day. Like one of the things I would do when I'd come home was I'd do Muay Thai, which is like kickboxing. So I had a bag where I could just kind of mentally press the reset button by just doing a few rounds hitting the bag. Even if I wasn't frustrated, it was just a good release and a good cue that, hey, I'm done with my teaching day and now I'm going to focus on leisure, or my dissertation in that case. So what approaches do you use to develop spiritual capacity? Now, I want to leave you with a quote at the very end. Quote, in a corporate environment that is changing at warp speed, performing consistently at high levels is more often and more necessary than ever. Narrow interventions simply aren't sufficient anymore. Companies can't afford to address their employees' cognitive capacities while ignoring their physical, emotional, and spiritual well-being. On the playing field or in the boardroom, high performance depends as much on how people renew and recover energy as on how they expend it, on how they manage their lives as much as on how they manage their work. When people feel strong and resilient physically, mentally, emotionally, and spiritually, they perform better, with more passion for longer. They win, their families win, and the corporations that employ them win, end quote. If you were to replace like corporation with district, that quote is so relevant to today and to many educators, I imagine. Whatever you are doing in education, whether you're an admin, an educator, paraprofessional, curriculum developer, whatever, if you were to start thinking of your position, your career, in a way that you might think of it as if you're making millions a year, which I hope you are, and you had like millions of fans who are cheering you on when you have a great lesson, or you develop like a great lesson plan, you're constantly watching the public eye, and you just want to perform at your best all the time. What kind of approaches would you use? Ironically, I imagine you'd probably step away from and learn to recover more from what you were doing as an educator. And again, I say this as somebody who's wearing a shirt that says grinding for XP and is recording in 95-degree plus temperature in my house because I am committed to creating content, regardless of how hot or cold it is in here. Just think of me as the non-binary version of One Punch Man. I'm always training no matter how hot or cold it gets. And if you don't get that reference, that's okay. Now, normally in these episodes, I like to end with some lingering questions and thoughts, but I've actually talked about different ways that I've recovered in many other episodes that I link to in the show notes. But I also collaboratively talked about some of these approaches that I use with Jen Manley over the summer for CSTA's conference. So what I'm going to do in the show notes is I'm going to include a link to some resources that we provided. These resources are pretty robust. There's a lot of different ideas and approaches that you can use. So I'm going to link to the content that was in that particular session. So make sure you check out the show notes at jaredoleary.com. As always, if you enjoy this particular episode, just let other people know. Share an episode, share the link to my website, or leave a review, whatever. It just helps more people find the free content that I create. And there's a bunch of it on my website. Bunch of computer science education, bunch of drumming, and a bunch of gaming stuff. Thank you so much for listening to this episode. I hope you are much cooler than I am right now. Stay tuned for an episode next week. Until then, I hope you're all staying safe and are having a wonderful week.